Good afternoon, and of course, thanks for asking AOC to present here today. A non-publicised but essential service provided by HES is the Human Remains Call-off contract, an emergency call-off contract to deal with the rapid recovery of human remains on non-development sites, such as coastal erosion and agriculture, so sites with no associated planning condition. Between 2003 and 2022, AOC have managed the service on behalf of HES on 4 occasions, completing around 100 projects, many of which are now published. Of course, other units have managed this contract, but I will only be speaking about the sites I am familiar with. The following talk will provide a brief summary of the works completed by AOC, its importance to the archaeological record and the heritage sector generally. In contrast to the 19th and 20th century, archaeology in the 21st century is now dominated by commercial archaeology. This is developer-led archaeology, paid for by, among others, housing developers, road builders, and wind farms. And this slide shows some examples of these sites. So this is a site we dug at Camelin, and a ceramic works in Glasgow, and some other things in Brunton. This is demonstrated by the fact that of the 7,000 people employed by the heritage industry in the UK, 6,200 are employed in commercial archaeology. Of course, community archaeology has a major role to play also, with some of the most important archaeological projects completed in Scotland recently being developed by and for local heritage groups, such as the Ascent group who excavated at Clacthall Broch, often in conjunction with archaeology units. And of course, the ARP audience will be familiar with many of these sites, with colleagues having spoken about many of them here. But less well known, perhaps, is the archaeological works completed by HES in the form of call-off contracts. There are 3 main contracts: conservation, properties and care, and human remains, all of which are responsible for some really interesting but perhaps less well-known research. The Human Remains Call-off focuses on the rapid recovery of human bone identified on sites, with some investigation into the source of the material. The work is dependent on human remains being reported to HES, a task usually undertaken by local regional archaeologists following their initial discovery, usually by a member of the public. And this is perhaps a rare occasion when so many archaeological stakeholders work together, and of course it emphasises the importance of these council curators and their ability to be able to visit and report these sites in a world where their jobs are often under threat from cuts. Between 2003 and 2022, AOC have completed over 100 of these projects, from Shetland to the Western Isles and down to the Scottish borders. As you can see from the map, most of the sites are coastal, and this is simply because they are identified as a consequence of coastal erosion. There are hundreds of sites that have been exposed and damaged by the weather in recent years, not just human remains, but also settlement sites. And while coastal erosion is not a new problem, the Neolithic site at Skara Brae in Orkney having been exposed in this way in the 19th century, it's becoming more of a problem as global warming increases. Now, these investigations are often very limited and comprise the recovery of disarticulated and incomplete skeletal remains, as this slide demonstrates. Often there is no obvious parent feature, and these sites that we have investigated, many require no further works, the material being archived. However, the contract has provided some spectacular research, often in collaboration with other specialists. Of the sites that have been investigated, around 52 have gone on to secondary post-excavation analysis. We can't of course discuss every site, but I will highlight some of the work and the broad themes we have found. Now, it is rare for the contract to investigate Neolithic burial. The reason for this is quite simple. Neolithic burial practice usually comprises the deposition of human remains within larger tombs. As I am sure you're all familiar with some of the more famous ones, such as Clavacairns, Campster and Mace Howe. As these sites are scheduled, unless there are newly discovered examples, we do not normally investigate them. The exception to this is some remains we identified at the Giant's Grave, Arran. Some animal disturbance required a minor investigation which revealed finds and bone related to its Neolithic use. Generally speaking, Bronze Age burials are the most common burials found in excavated in Scotland. There are at least 500 recorded examples in Scotland, so it's no surprise that this is the most common burial type identified under the contract. Although many of these are truncated and often disarticulated, many are quite spectacular and monumental, the three here being excellent examples, and these cists are from Orkney, Bute and the Highland area. And here's another example we excavated at scale in Orkney. Now, many of these have now been published, with 3 examples at Kelso, Campbelltown and Orkney having been published in the Scottish Archaeological Journal and the Proceedings of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, respectively. But not all of them are published individually. We're currently working with Bruce Mann and Claire Herbert of the Aberdeenshire Council Archaeology Service to publish the results of our northeastern Bronze Age burials, with those excavated by the late Ian Shepherd, to provide a more comprehensive synthesis of such examples. Similarly, we are working with Wessex Archaeology and some PhD students to bring to publication the Bronze Age site at Allesdale, Barra. And as the contract has developed, we've tried to produce more synthesis to maximise the results of this research. Perhaps more surprising of the contract is that 6 Iron Age burials have been found. It is long discussed issue that we have very little evidence for formal burials in the Iron Age of Scotland. Research by, among others, Ian Arbett and Vicky Ginn have demonstrated that human remains can be found in all sorts of contexts, including as disarticulated bones deposited under structures such as Hornish Point, where a 12-year-old boy was found under the floor of a wheelhouse, or perhaps displayed in a building. A skull with holes through it was found in a Caithness broch, suggesting that it may have been hung in the building. Similarly, Iron Age remains have been found in contexts such as caves, as cremations, and deposited in earlier monuments, but more formal burial is still rare. This example of a so-called warrior burial with associated grave goods is one of only a few excavated in Scotland, and this is distinctive and obviously Iron Age, but atypical of the material that we normally find. Research by Wimster in 1974 listed 24 known burials, which had crept up to 150 known examples in 2009. So to find 6, or 4% of the total sample size, is quite exceptional. In particular, excavations completed in the West Isles have provided new evidence for Iron Age burials in the form of 4 inhumations. The form and layout of these burials would previously have led researchers to suggest that they could range in date from the Bronze Age to the early historic period. But new research has demonstrated that these are Iron Age, and we should perhaps consider other undated examples. The results of this research has now been published in the Scottish Archaeological Journal. Similarly to Iron Age graves, it is relatively rare to be able to excavate burials from the early historic period. This is in part due to known examples being scheduled, such as the Pictish barrow cemeteries known in forests or in more formal cemeteries, but also as so many of them have been truncated by ploughing. The slide on the left shows excavation of a barrow in forest, and this was practically ploughed out completely by the time it was excavated. The slide on the right shows a better surviving example that we excavated in Perthshire. While rare, the call of contract does occasionally require larger sites to be excavated, and on 3 occasions we have had to excavate a cemetery. At Lockhead, the extension of a quarry identified a Pictish dated Longkist cemetery containing up to 15 graves. The slide demonstrates how we initially found the site protruding from the quarry edge and the process of excavation. This publication of this site involved a collaboration with Dr. Adrian Maldonado, now of the National Museum of Scotland, who was then studying early Iron Age burials for his PhD in Glasgow. More recently, at Scalloway, Shetland, bodies were found on the site next to the previously excavated Broch site. This slide in particular demonstrates the difficulty archaeologists often have excavating through the existing structures, fence lines and modern development. And most spectacular of all, at Auldhame in East Lothian, an early medieval chapel and cemetery built over a probable promontory fort was excavated, and I'm just going to take a bit more time to describe this fully. Excavation on the headland at Auldhame revealed 1,000 years of burial activity and liturgical practice, the nature of which changed over the course of the millennia. It charted the birth and death of a church from a monastic settlement established in the 7th century AD, which became a parish church in the 12th century and ended its life in the 17th century as a burial aisle or mortuary chapel for its wealthy landowners. Undoubtedly, the most significant elements of the evidence from Auldhame are those from the Anglian activity and Norse contact. Between the 7th and 9th centuries AD, a paramonastic community associated with the Anglian Saint Balter flourished on the headland. Whether Balter actually founded the community is moot, but he was revered locally throughout the medieval period, and it's probably his connection and possibly his burial there that ensured the sanctity of the location for the next millennia. The monastic settlement ceased to exist sometime towards the end of the 9th century AD, an event which may have been influenced by Viking activity around the coast. Amongst the 9th to 10th century graves was that of a young man buried with a spear and prick spurs and belt set, all of which associate him with the Norse communities around the Irish Sea. Now, the scale, size and importance of the Auldhame site provided a rare opportunity within the contract for on-site outreach, and over 100 volunteers were provided with archaeological training over a 3-month period. Volunteers were given a rare opportunity to excavate human remains, plus worked with artefacts that are rare even for seasoned professionals who have worked on hundreds of sites. And Auldhame is now published and has provided international level research. And this slide demonstrates all of the experts who worked on that site. Again, the modern excavation of Viking and Norse graves is rare. Modern excavations of graves of this period are in single numbers, but on 4 occasions we have been required to excavate Viking dated burials. This slide demonstrates the expertise often required to excavate these sites, and our team of experts, including conservators, had to excavate within eroding sand with a box around them. Most spectacular of all was a series of Viking burials, one of which was buried with a sword, shield and axe at Mayback, and I hope you can all see the shield boss and sword in the slide on the left. Post-excavation analysis of this is ongoing, but we have already required expertise from around the UK to help us with this. And perhaps most surprising of all is the relatively high number of sailor burials. This is of course a generic term for bodies identified on the coast, and when reported these are usually expected to be prehistoric, but on 4 occasions excavation has revealed them to be post-18th century, and the image on the right shows a leather boot, probably from the 19th century. So moving on then to summarise. To summarise, the call of contract is an exceptional vehicle for research. Excavation and post-excavation is expensive. It costs a lot to complete these projects, often located on now remote islands. And while you have heard of many of interesting projects, it's rare for there to be such a combined drive to initiate up-to-date research. The contract gives us a rare opportunity to analyse sites that normally wouldn't be looked at, and more importantly, to publish them. Of the 100 sites investigated, 20 have now been published, with several more having been accepted for publication, and more to come once the research is complete. Auldhame is perhaps the most famous and most accomplished, and is published as a Society of Antiquaries monograph. In addition, many of the sites have been subject to additional analysis beyond the usual post-ex requirements of assemblage. And this slide shows additional research being undertaken on the Lochhead quarry material. Many of the sites have provided the basis for PhD analysis, training and synthesis, with Auldhame assemblage in particular being analysed by multiple PhD students. Other sites are being used for isotopic analysis to help determine the movement of people in the past, for example the Bronze Age cemetery at Alasdair and the Pictish site at Scalloway. And we are also working with the Francis Crick Institute on the 1000 Ancient Genomes project, a project on developing sampling strategies where any data we generate on sex, ancestry, relatedness and disease can help to address outstanding site-specific, regional or national scale research questions. Now, how is this information disseminated? As well as high-level publications, AOC staff have spoken over 30 times at various local and national conferences. The rapid nature of the contract means that volunteers are not often on site, but where possible we work with interested parties. For example, at Auldhame, we ran it in conjunction with local groups as a training excavation and with multiple open days, allowing the public access to the site, including visits by local heritage groups and young archaeologist groups. And finally, the call of contract is an excellent opportunity to upskill archaeologists. Over the contract, we have provided multiple training sessions on the excavation of human remains. Multiple staff have been able to work on unique assemblages, including Norse, Viking and Anglian artefacts, and our conservation team have gained valuable on-site experience. We have mentored various staff in report writing to publication, with many of our younger staff having now published site reports. And finally, we have started to develop digital survey on these sites. Our forthcoming survey at St Columba's Cave will be used for photogrammetry. So just to say thanks for having me, and thanks for all those who have worked on these projects. The contract is essential, and it's essential that the people listed up here are employed to help us undertake this work. Okay, thank you for having me.